colleagues, students, friends, citizens of Wyoming, welcome and good evening. On behalf of the University of Wyoming, my name is Jean Garrison, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our thought-provoking conversation tonight on civil discourse. On this day of remembrance and service, 17 years after the fall of the Twin Towers, the attack on the Pentagon, and the flight or crash of Flight 93 in rural Pennsylvania, I can think of nothing better than to have this conversation tonight as a representation of our democracy. This conversation embodies what we are in this country in terms of having a conversation on important public issues. Tonight, we are launching the UW Presidential Engagement Initiative, which tonight is in partnership with the Malcolm Wallop Civic Engagement Project. We bring you this keynote with Alexander Heffner, who is the host of the PBS program, The Open Mind, followed by a panel discussion with notable Wyoming public servants. The UW Presidential Engagement Initiative acknowledges a very important goal in UW's strategic plan, Breaking Through 2017 to 2022, and this focuses on having conversations and developing our relationships with Wyoming communities. In that spirit, tonight, this event is being broadcast, live streamed through both public radio and public television, and I want to thank both public television and public radio for that partnership. We've also partnered with the Malcolm Wallop Civic Engagement Project, which celebrates Senator Malcolm Wallop's distinguished career as a Wyoming public servant. He served 3 terms as Wyoming senator, and prior to that, he did serve in the legislature as well. Senator Wallop's life was about conversations around ideas, and the Wallop Civic Engagement Initiative honors that legacy, providing a platform for those making the effort to learn and champion their beliefs. A particular welcome to students here this afternoon. We will be doing that tonight with this program, and we will be having a conversation on an issue and a way of having discourse on public topics that very much embodies the nature of politics here in Wyoming, but also really is a very important discussion here in the nation. So we are joining a national conversation on civil discourse. Tonight's conversation, entitled Civil Discourse in an Uncivil Age, the Quest for a Post-Partisan Citizenship, focuses on the effects of divisiveness on discourse and governance and the impact of social media, fake news, and filter bubbles that polarize information intake. This program is made possible through a large collaboration on the part of many people here on campus. This includes the Office of the President, the Center for Global Studies, the College of Arts and Sciences, the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies, as well as I mentioned previously, public television, Wyoming Public Media, and the Humanities Council. It is supported in part by Wyoming Humanities through a generous grant from the Andrew Mellon Foundation. I want to say a special thanks to Stephanie Anderson, the Melward L. Simpson Fund in Political Science, to Lori Gonzalez and Erica Helgeson at the Center for Global Studies and Global Engagement Office, and also the students from the Center for Global Studies, the school, and the Political Science Club. Our program, as I noted, is being live streamed through public television's website, which is wyomingpbs.org/civiclife. And you can actually ask questions. If you are watching us live, I will note that email address here to you in a moment. This program will also be aired as part of a special episode of Wyoming Chronicle in October. If you are watching or listening to this program, you are invited to submit questions for the Q&A period by email at civility@wyomingpbs.org. So let me turn to our program. Alexander Heffner is the host of The Open Mind on PBS. He is the co-author of a documentary history of the United States, which is published from Penguin in 2018. Actually, it's available for sale outside in the auditorium lobby. The Open Mind is a nationally broadcast public affairs interview program and the longest running in the history of American public television. First broadcast in May of 1956, this thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas across politics, media, technology, the arts, and realms of civic life is broadcast from New York City nationally through 200 PBS affiliates. To ensure geographic diversity and representation, Alexander travels around the country. So he's been to a number of places. I believe he's in Missouri. Fairly recently, he's been to MIT, and we're very pleased that he's here at the University of Wyoming tonight. He's actually been in classes over the last couple of days, and it's been really nice to have him be interacting with Wyoming students. Alexander has covered American politics, civic life, and millennials for leading newspapers and magazines, and his work has been profiled in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times. A native New Yorker, he's a graduate of Harvard. The keynote is followed by a panel discussion featuring 3 notable Wyoming public servants who can provide a Wyoming perspective on this discussion. The panelists include Marilyn Kite, former Justice of the Wyoming Supreme Court, who also served a term as a Chief Justice of the court. Mr. Timothy Stubson, former member of the Wyoming House of Representatives. He's a graduate of the University of Wyoming College of Law. He's also a graduate in International Studies. Let me note that Marilyn Kite is also a graduate of the University of Wyoming in International Affairs. Alfie Ellis is a member of the Wyoming Senate from Cheyenne and a former Assistant Attorney General of Wyoming. She's a graduate of the Colorado School of Law, please forgive her, but she's also a graduate of the political science. I want to note this because all 3 are graduates of the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies here at the University of Wyoming, and I think that's terrific. So we'll make Alexander an honorary graduate of the University of Wyoming at the end. He is a graduate of Harvard. The three questions I want you to think about as a starting point are these. What are possible prescriptions to correct the vicious cycle of this polarized political debate that we are experiencing today? I would note this is nothing new in American politics, however. How can our footprint translate into pro-social instead of anti-social behavior? And third, how can the press restore faith in our civic life and the construction of public policy? As we get started, I ask that you silence your cell phones and remind you that this program is being broadcast live and recorded for public television. We invite broad participation during the Q&A period. I will ask people to ask questions rather than making long statements, just so that we can get through a number of questions. And I also ask you to note that when we get to the Q&A period after the panel discussion, you can come down to the mics that are in these 2 aisles facing the stage. Also remember, if you are out around the state watching this, you can email questions to civility@wyomingpbs.org. So, maybe we should get started. Please help me give a warm Wyoming welcome to Alexander Heffner to discuss Civil Discourse in an Uncivil Age, the quest for a post-partisan citizenship. Alexander.
Thank you all very much, and I really want to extend my thanks to Jean and to Stephanie at the school here, who have been wonderfully gracious, warm, and hospitable to this Yankee from the Northeast. And I have exit signs there in case I'm shooed away. But I've been so delighted to engage with your students. So most of all, I want to thank the students who are here in the audience and the students who might be viewing this live on YouTube, and the students I interacted with over the course of 2 days of classes, really remarkable people. I've talked about those 3 questions that Jean presented over the course of the 2016 campaign, but really predating that campaign and predating the electricity of toxic partisanship and polarization that have so skewed and dominated our politics in recent years. Since we started with those 3 questions, I want to open with 3 quotes that I think can help frame this conversation. 3 quotes, I might add, that my grandfather, who was the original host of the Open Mind at PBS and the founding host, imparted to me as a young person learning American history and most recently updating the book that Jean referenced. First was something that he heard growing up: employment rises and falls. Those are clear facts. We need to ensure that the foundation of literacy in our civic identity, the foundation, the bedrock, is that established knowledge. And there seems to be an assault today in the media sphere and the political sphere on established knowledge. And Gene was referencing this idea, well, hasn't there been a disunion in this country before? The crisis of incivility is not new from the American perspective. There was a civil war. There have been marches to civil society that have included civil discourse, civil disobedience, civil speech engagement. It's not a new concept that we're addressing dispute, whether it was over slavery years ago or the movement towards civil rights and full empowerment, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, and later on the security of our people, our ability to vote, our ability to assemble, our ability to practice our religion, irrespective of what we look like. And so it's my stipulation that civility is not just some kind of norms, decency, honor, values. It's really the underpinning and the essence of what we need to be if we're going to preserve and perpetuate a civil society in the United States. And so I've identified over the course of my work in media and politics 3 impediments, 3 obstacles, 3 barriers that I think fall into this classification of incivility. And there are some chickens and there are eggs, and I think the correlation is a subjective question, but I see them as bigotry, obstructionism, and dysfunction. And I see them on the national stage. You can see them in state houses. There's more one-on-one interaction, which I think we'll get to later on in the panel, which means that we do have to be more civil to each other when we're engaging and interacting with our neighbors who are serving in the state senate or who are editors of the newspaper. When things are nationalized, it becomes more challenging. And so the crisis of uncivil bigotry, I think, has led us to a point of obstruction. What do I mean by that? I mean that there's not just a bigotry along racial lines or ethnic lines that's been spurred by rhetoric from our president or rhetoric from past political office holders or media, but it's been a downward cycle that has degraded and dumbed down our capacity to learn from each other as human beings. And instead, that bigotry, an intellectual bigotry against people who don't believe exactly what we do or you do or your family does. So it's across the world of ideas, it's across geographies, it's across racial and ethnic lines, but I think that when you can't engage with someone because they're a Republican or a Democrat, you find yourselves ensnared in this constant impasse. I call it obstruction. And we've seen that play out in the American political system in different situations, with Supreme Court appointments, proceeding with a process that is dependent upon what your political affiliation is. And it's happened to both parties, and it's happened over a period of time where that process has been degraded. And I would point to an episode of The Open Mind I recorded with Harvard Law School Dean Martha Minow that I was just watching earlier this morning preparing for this talk that really gives insight into the politicization of a process that is supposed to be deliberate, building bridges of understanding, listening to a prospective nominee, and then ultimately advising and consent on. That's one example of where I think the obstruction has been most visible. Ultimately, if you look at approval ratings, both of our chief executive and of our Congress on the federal level, it's dysfunction. It's an incivility of dysfunction. So how can you have a civil society when the people who are supposed to be represented in these institutions of government lack a feeling or a stake of empowerment in a culture that has grown to prove, to serve the interests of aristocrats and oligarchs and not the people. And that's really the perception, whether a Democrat or Republican has been in the Oval Office in the last decade. The perception has been a majority of this country is not content, is not satisfied, and that to me is one indication of dysfunction, but another indication of dysfunction is the kind of expressions of bigotry, whether it was hating on Mexicans and from one candidate during the campaign or Mexican Americans, or whether it was hating on Middle America, the West, or people who are irredeemable, deplorable. It's been on both sides. This crisis of the way we're speaking to each other is not wanting to learn from each other about what's the causal relationship with your views on issues and how we ought to construct a forward-thinking public policy incorporating conservative, liberal, and centrist ideas along the way. And so I want to really present to you the crisis as I see it from the point of view of someone who operates in the contemporary media environment. I think that over the course of the 2016 campaign and the ensuing months, these phenomena were further exacerbated by a media that is deeply polarized and that feeds the beast of what the latest tweet is all-consuming, not the substantive work of or business of the government to serve the interests of the people and to focus on areas of policy that can be prescriptive in solving problems or not adding to problems. And that is, to me, the core problem. When you have a media and a politics that are furthering the entrenchment of ideological gridlock and orthodoxy instead of finding opportunities for conversation. So my format on the Open Mind is one-on-one and is really intended to solicit, whether it's Bernie Sanders, who I had on, or within the last several years, or Mitch Daniels, Republicans, Democrats. You know, the format, the essence of my program is not to read the latest tweet and identify that controversy and, you know, what has been generated as a function of contemporary media, specifically Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, owned by Google, of course, is an outrage machine that does produce an antisocial, not pro-social media context. In real time, that means that over the course of the 2016 campaign, folks were sowing discontent, not just people outside of this country who have been identified as Russian interference, but people in this country who thought it was more important to rev up a disinformation campaign about the political party they oppose than seeking to find common ground. And those websites that I just identified, while they have understood the importance, at least attempted to understand in recent congressional testimonies and some action on the part of Facebook, in general, they continue not to be where they should be. One thing that's not going on ad nauseum, as it was during the campaign and subsequent months, was the monetization of the political rage and disinformation that was feeding the further evidence that we saw every day on the mainstream media of tweets and counter tweets from our president, from folks who are engaging with the president, and then from all the actors who are, you know, further inciting division on social media. And so for many months leading up to the campaign, you could advertise on social media, not be identified, and proliferate hate, disinformation. There have been recorded episodes of that. But worst of all, you had the opportunity to make money if you ran YouTube ads or Facebook ads or Twitter ads, and in the process of providing this disservice to our democracy, to degrade our literacy and our common values, the result was people not only feeding a hate machine, but making money off of it at the same time. In 2 weeks I have on the program the vice president of Google News. He's one of several vice presidents, but he's the person responsible for ensuring that Google remains free and open under what has been an assault on specific journalists and freedom of the press. And I am by no means suggesting that a regulatory framework, anything other than what we have for television operators, is something that might be considered to ensure that this ad is paid by X entity or X candidate. X organization, which is still not a requirement when folks run ads on social media. I think that along with the First Amendment being preserved, we ought to preserve transparency. So some of that is recognizing the FCC is played by certain rules when it comes to television, which haven't been applied in the current technological environment. We hope that in the wake of some of these crises that have emerged, there will be self-regulation, and I can talk more about that and some of the questions you may have about particular episodes of disinformation, misinformation, their removal from YouTube or other platforms, and what that means. I talked about 3 quotes that I think are helpful in framing the civility problem or incivility problem. I just mentioned 3 particular, I think, trends or difficulties that we have that can be identified as a source of incivility: the dysfunction, obstruction, bigotry. Well, I want to talk about solutions in the time I have left up here. And solutions in also the same manner, 3 solutions. It's obvious from our politics that we don't engage each other in civil discourse. We don't even engage each other anymore if we're not from that party or that disposition. When I was based at Franklin Pierce University as a Fitzwater Fellow in the run-up to the 2016 campaign, we came up with a model called primary dialogue. And at that point, there were candidates from both parties. I had interviewed some of them on my program before they announced or declared their candidacies. New Hampshire PBS was obviously involved in inviting us in conversation with campaigns and candidates. And we thought that it would be remarkably healthy and an antidote to the toxicity of that moment and the rhetoric that was beginning to come out for an exchange of ideas around a table representing both parties. And we got buy-in from candidates of both parties. Ultimately, those candidates who agreed to participate in our primary dialogue, which is going to be co-hosted by Franklin Pierce, New Hampshire PBS, myself involved, along with the director of the Fitzwater Institute, became aware that candidates who accepted our invitation received warnings from the RNC and DNC that they shouldn't be participating. And if they do, they'll be barred from entering in the sanctioned RNC and DNC events, which are, of course, the big jackpots when it comes to building your name, your ID recognition around the state, even though, of course, like here, New Hampshire is quite interested in retail politics and meeting folks that you vote for. The 3 models for correcting our uncivil discourse, I think, start with that understanding that we can't operate in a politics where we enable those once wedge issues, whether they were abortion, reproductive rights, capital punishment, life, death, the NFL kneeling at the flag. These issues are not central. They're important, but we can't, even if we disagree powerfully, we can't allow them to stymie our ability to really engage with each other. When we think about the issues that most value, that really have most value to our communities, education, healthcare, that we're treating each other, our neighbors, our peers, our friends, our family with dignity, that if we're contributing to our, the collective betterment or perfection of this union, that folks ought to recognize that in blue states and red states we may choose to govern differently in certain jurisdictions, and yet we can and we should be able to have dialogue. So that was the origin of the primary dialogue model, which failed because we didn't do it. We solicited feedback from citizens and students and got a lot of strong energy in what is an independent, fiercely independent state, libertarian like your own here. But ultimately, we didn't bring it to fruition because of the all-powerful DNC and RNC. The second model from a media perspective that I would encourage us to look at in facing the threat or confronting the threats of bigotry, obstruction, and dysfunction and uncivil discourse would be the recognition on the part of folks in the media that we have to be constructive actors in the perpetuation of our civil public life. And that means that those public officials who are most committed to problem solving, for instance, there's a problem solvers caucus that my hometown representative happens to belong to, along with a co-chair from Oklahoma. It's a diverse constituency. There are folks representing us who are committed to a vision of bridge building towards consensus and compromise and ultimately a collective good. One idea that I'll throw at you is really giving life to the patriots in our civic life, giving a show, giving an hour on network television, cable television, radio, podcast, whatever the platform might be that you listen to or view or read, giving a chance for folks who are committed to bipartisan cooperation in the limelight. You notice on the cable operators, you often have guests who further distance ourselves from any potential of that kind of learning experience, how the other half lives. And I think, I've used the example before of two senators, for instance, doing a reality show where you wake up with them and each week you see the process of governing. I mean, if we elected a reality TV star who a lot of folks thought would lose the ideological orthodoxy in favor of a more pragmatic approach, don't we need, if our entertainment culture is amusing us to death, don't we need to find sources of nutrition in our media that are going to give a platform to real problem solvers and dedicated stewards of that common good from across the country? So I had used examples of people that had been committed to bipartisan cooperation. I'd use the example of Pat Leahy and John McCain, but you could go to Joe Manchin in West Virginia, you could go to Susan Collins of Maine, but you could go in an earlier era of our politics to Alan Simpson, right here, whom I called as a high school student and asked if he would be an advisor to a newborn publication called Scoop 08. And he, along with Gary Hart, right here next to you, decided, we're going to sign up to advise these students reporting on the 08 campaign. And I bring that up because, of course, McCain and his own family were the first to acknowledge his shortcomings, but celebrating his life, we recognize that in that moment, in the 2008 campaign, he did put country before partisan or even his own campaign in that cause when he told a woman in the crowd in the most civil and maybe the most notable civil moment of our politics in the last decade, no. President Obama is an honorable family man. Then Senator Obama is an honorable family man. He's not an Arab. He's not a Muslim. And he said, you got that wrong. And you look at the current rendition of our partisan politics that exploit tribal allegiance, but also sometimes lies, falsehoods, mistruths in pursuit of appeasing or appealing to base politics, going back to primary dialogue. So we talked about primary dialogue. Now we talked about this idea of the media encompassing the constructive perspectives when we see them bringing us down to our, punching at the gut and not really thinking analytically about problem solving. And the third is something I bring up in any classroom that I ever go to, and that is back to that fundamental literacy, because I don't think we can possess or retain civility if we don't care about being honestly informed and coming to some conclusive outcomes that are, facts. And so something as simple as encouraging folks to be discerning, discriminating readers or navigators of the internet, something I was taught at a young age at the advent of kind of being a very old millennial, the inception of Google, that no, you're not just going to search a term on Google. At the time I was taught, you should search a term on Google and then discriminate against all sites except for orgs or edus. And that was because at the time, those sites were most reliable when we didn't have a robust Wikipedia, which is an exception to that rule, that we wanted, reliable, credible organizations to inform folks. That was the admonition and advice of librarians from an early age for me, but it speaks to, I think, a difficulty we have in accepting that, yes, the First Amendment, just like, and I want to get at this in a second, our kind of capitalistic core as a society, we have to always preserve that, and I think that's indelibly preserved in our nature. But the idea that the internet, those websites, those social platforms that I alluded to before, have no kind of classification system of saying, this is nonfiction, this is fiction. If you go into a library, if you go into a bookstore, if you go into a doctor's office, they're going to look at the truth, the expert assessment. If there's some subjective measure to be made, you're going to be using the scientific process to judge how to treat someone's condition or what advice to give them. And so we've lacked for the better part of a decade, but even going back to the outset of the internet, that kind of strategic classification online where the next generation can really become confident in reputable sources being the bedrock of search. And we know that our young people today, especially the post-millennials, are deeply attached to smartphones, electronic devices, and digital online search, whether that's Snapchat messages, SMS messages being exchanged, or navigating on browsers on your smartphone. That is really the dominant source of news and information. So we want it to be real news and information and not dis or misinformation. In closing, I just say I was encouraged by the open exchange of ideas I had with the students and thinking about that quest for a post-partisan citizenship. And I don't want you to leave this presentation, I don't know what's going to happen next, Gene, but the next 5 minutes or 3 minutes or however much time I have left without you recognizing that this state voted for Harry Truman, this state voted for Lyndon Johnson. If you don't believe that a post-partisan politics, or at least a rejiggering of our politics, is possible, you haven't studied American history. You haven't studied the Democratic and Republican parties and the tumult experience and the change of character of those parties in terms of positions, in terms of worldview. And sometimes it's tied to allegiance to the party in power, the president in power. Sometimes it's tied to elements on the ground. And I don't want to leave here without telling you that I received an alert from a reputable news outlet as I was coming on stage, and I wanted to share with you. And that was, it was from the New York Times, and it was stating a fact that the president touts. Unemployment is down, and the economy is strong. And it was alluding to the markets in particular, broadly speaking. And it goes on to say, but for Americans without much education, the jobs they can get may not pay enough to live. I think that the most uncivil condition of all that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump recognized, I think Bernie Sanders in this very auditorium, was that we were being degraded by a kind of cannibalistic capitalism that was overtaking us. That wasn't quite the messaging that Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump used, but they definitely said that in their own words, in their own messaging. And in the minute now that I have left, I want to emphasize to you, this question is not the most uncivil condition at all. The grave, grave inequities that we've experienced and the fact that in response to public policy, whether it's the corporate tax cuts or other tax cuts we've had in recent years, wage growth for everybody, except really the top tier of America, it's just gone like this, stagnant or barely up, sometimes down for folks. And that's not just true of people without higher education. That's true of people with higher education. And I think that it's here in Missouri, where Gene said I spoke last semester, and in these states where we have to reframe the issues and understand what it means to be civil again. The dignity of our society, the dignity of our children and our families, I think it depends on recognizing that there is not a socialistic or communistic or whatever threat to this union. There is a quest, and I think the quest for a post-partisan politics will be born in a quest for a compassionate capitalistic society. And if that is the rhetoric emanated from Senate candidates or maybe a presidential candidate in 2020, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, I think that that strategy will not only be effective for their political future, but it will help preserve the fundamental fabric of the society, which I would insist and promise you is civil society, civil rights, civil disobedience, civil discourse. With that, I want to thank you for your attention this evening, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Invite Marilyn Kite, Timothy Stubbson, and Affie Ellis to join us. And as they join us, I just want to say, Alexander, thank you very much for getting us started this evening. And thank you very much for the Wyoming reference. So before we get to Q&A, those of us who organized this and invited Alexander to the University of Wyoming thought it'd be really interesting to bring three more local voices to the questions that were posed this evening. So I'd like to start with you, Marilyn. Let me just remind folks that Marilyn served 3 terms in the Wyoming Supreme Court, and one of those was as our Chief Justice. So Marilyn, would you start us off?
Well, there's a lot to react to. First of all, I guess I think it's the most positive thing is that we are having this discussion and that we feel the need to address this condition we find ourselves in. It is interesting to me that as you go back over history, there were a lot of times in our country's history where we weren't very civil to each other, and including in the political campaigns and the solicitation of support of one party over another. In preparation for another event, I was reading about the names that Jefferson and Adams called each other, which I can't use here in polite society. So that sometimes I think that comes from a strong belief in your position. If you believe that strongly that you're right, you can get strident. But I think the fear that I have, at least, and I think many of us do, is the reason we need civility is not just because it's a good thing, it's the right thing to do, it's what your mother told you to be. We can't work together, and we've got big problems. So it's the need to create an environment where collaboration and negotiation and God forbid, compromise can happen. And if we don't have an environment where people are decent to each other, they're not going to find those answers. And whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, it's that part that disturbs me the most. And I think in reaction to what you said, Alexander, about the media's responsibility, it's kind of interesting because I think the media goes to what we as a public are like, or are at least paying attention to. And so we, the voter, we, the person that goes and turns on their television, if we're looking for that kind of entertainment, so to speak, it encourages, I think, an uncivil presentation. And I think also that we will never solve these problems on a national stage, at least not quickly. But we sure can do that on a local level in your school board elections or discussions in your town councils, because that incivility has gone to that level. So in a way, it seems to me that it's our responsibility as individuals, whether it's the consumers of news or the voter, that you make your final decision based upon some strident, uncivil, and in some cases, untrue information. Then it's easy to blame those people in office, but I think the responsibility is really a personal one, and that's where we can make a difference. I heard our former governor, Mike Sullivan, say in response to what do we do about this situation, and he said that when he left for school, when he was a child, his parents told him one thing, and that was to be decent. And when you think about it, that's really all we need to do. We can disagree strongly, but we can do it with respect and decency of the person we're disagreeing with.
Tim Stubson. Tim, would you join us in this conversation?
You bet, and thanks for having me. It does the heart good, to see so many people that really care how we as citizens engage and how we move our state and our country forward. And I think as we talk about civility, one of the things that I sort of struggle with is what does that really mean, especially in this context of politics, because, in my mind, sometimes I go to, group hugs and warm fuzzies and that sort of thing, and I don't think that works really in the context of political civility, because, at its heart, politics is a contact sport, and we know it and we see it, and it is a system that is set up to be adversarial. And so, at its core, when politics is about exercising power, if you talk about civility without recognizing it, I think you can come up with maybe solutions that don't really work in the real world. But when I was first in the legislature, I think my first picture of civility happened just within days of me starting in the Wyoming House. And as a new member, there was a Representative Debbie Hammonds, from a Democrat from up in Washakie County. And she was presenting a bill that I thought was just a terrible idea. And I was kind of full of vim and vinegar, and I got up and I just slammed that bill, and I took it to task, and I managed to kill the bill. And Debbie was so ticked off at me, as I would be. She'd labored over it for an entire interim, and some punk came in and killed it. And she goes back to her desk, and I go back to mine. And then about 15 minutes later, it was time for me to present my very first bill. And I get up, and I'm standing there, and I'm telling everybody what a great idea it is, and I see out of the corner of my eye Debbie stand up and walk over to the lectern to speak. And I was like, okay, I know this is the way it's going to be, I guess. And Debbie stands up, and she pulls the microphone close, and she says, you know what, this bill is really a great idea. And, she went in, she sold the bill passed, and the bill's now, law in Wyoming. And it just was a great lesson that, if it's about policy, it's not about people. If you can recognize where the fight ends and the humanity begins, that to me is really civility in the political world. And so trying to figure out how we capture that, how we enforce that, how we do that. And one of the things, I'm a lawyer by trade. That's my day job. That's why I'm so well behaved next to Justice Kite. But in the courtroom, it's also an adversarial proceeding, and it's set up to be that way. And I mean, you've got people paying you to advocate for them and to advocate vigorously, not to be polite, not to be nice. So how, when all the incentives are wrong, how do you make that be a system that works? And the fact is, you have rules, and you have rules that are enforced, and that there are consequences for violating those, and it works. I mean, and you see it on the outside boundaries with rules of ethics and professional responsibility, but even narrower, there's a rule we have for our trial courtrooms, Uniform Rule 801, and it's really a be nice rule. And I'm trying. The language of it requires attorneys, anybody involved in the litigation proceedings, to act with candor, courtesy, and civility, and demonstrate personal honesty, fairness, and integrity. And that's a pretty high standard. But it's enforced, and I've seen judges take lawyers to task when they attack another lawyer personally. And it makes a difference, and it makes that adversarial system work. So how do you do that in politics? That's a little bit of a tougher question, I think. For me, sometimes, I don't think, frankly, that media is in a position to be the arbiter of what is civil necessarily, to set the rules of what civility should be, or to call out necessarily someone for being uncivil and someone for being civil. I think, as Marilyn said, they sort of reflect who we are as voters and as citizens, and I really think that's where it comes down to, as voters. And we've had, in our history, these bright lines in political discourse that you don't go across. And if you do, there's a consequence at the ballot box. And of course, we've seen politicians now on the left and the right steamroll through those boundaries. And I think what's really going to be interesting, maybe over the next 3 election cycles or so, is are we as a people, or are we as voters, are we going to decide that our ends justify any means? Or are we going to decide that, yes, there are certain boundaries we need to enforce to make certain that we as a country can continue to thrive and can continue to discuss? And if we do that, you'll see that at the ballot box. And as soon as those seeking elections start losing because of that conduct, you're going to see a change in the conduct.
Affy, you're up.
What they said. Thank you. In all seriousness, I want to thank the University of Wyoming for having this dialogue and conversation, because it's very important, and it's actually a reason I ran. I ran in the 2016 election, and I remember watching the news, and I saw candidates shouting at each other. And, I'm a mom of 3 kids, and so I'll talk a lot about my kids, and a lot of my lessons are really inspired by them, but I didn't like what they were seeing on TV. And so I thought, I can't make a difference at the national level, but certainly I can make a difference in my own state. And so since being elected, I've given a lot of thought to what this word civility really means. And like my other esteemed lawyerly colleagues on the stage, I went to the library in Cheyenne, and I looked up the word civility to find titles of books that would maybe give me some framework, maybe give you a good Webster's definition of what that word means. But my takeaway was kind of startling. I found George Washington's Rules of Civility alongside a copy of Miss Manners, Saves Civilization, and those were the 2 books that I found about civility, and they were in the etiquette aisle of the library. And then I started scrolling some other book titles that were in the political section, and I saw titles like this one, Bloodthirsty Bitches and Pious Pimps of Power. And it was really sad. There's no shortage of these kind of titles on the bookshelf. And so I think if any of you aspiring young writers out there want to craft a book that people might need to read, it would be about civility, because we really don't have a lot of good books out there. So thinking about what this means, since being elected, I've had my fair share of critics, people who have reached out to me. And one lady said, well, you signed up for this. And I'm going to tell you this flat out. No, I did not. I signed up to spend a lot of time away from my family, to take on another, what could be full-time job on top of my profession as a lawyer. And that's a lot of work, and that's what I signed up for, was trying to do something good for Wyoming. I didn't sign up for personal attacks or vulgar remarks. So if you are one of those kind of people, I'm just going to flat out tell you, no, we did not sign up for that. As I talked to my kids about what civility means, and they asked on the car ride over here, the best example I can give is, what's your favorite color? And in asking my kids that, I've heard, the variety of reasons why my daughter loves blue, why my son loves red. I explained to them why I love orange. And it made me think about that's how we should be talking about politics and our political views. There was never one part of me that said, well, you love blue, you must hate America, and you're the stupidest person I've ever met. Or how someone would criticize me for having orange as my favorite color. And so I wish we had political conversations that were much more civil about how we talk about our favorite colors or what our favorite movies are. So something to think about. And again, another kind of golden rule that I talk about with my kids is, if you can't say something nice, don't say it at all. I think in politics, as a public official, my rule is if you can't say it to my face, then don't say it at all. Because I've found that whenever I've approached critics who are very, bold in social media posts or sending me emails, they have a very difficult time looking me in the eye. And so I think, as you're standing there, maybe reading an article on Facebook and you want to throw a comment out there, take a time to think about whether or not you would feel comfortable saying those words in front of your grandmother or to the intended recipient. I have a ton of notes, but, part of, I think, the solution is really asking folks to articulate their positions. And, I hear a lot of people say, I hate so-and-so, that guy's a bozo, they're idiots, they don't know anything. We're in a college auditorium, and so maybe this message doesn't resonate with a lot of folks, but hopefully it resonates with the people in this room and the people who are taking the time to listen to this program or watch it. Articulate. I disagree with President Trump's policy on XYZ. I disagree with Senator so-and-so's statement or handling of whatever situation. And I really feel like whenever I hear people say, I don't know what to do about civility, I can honestly say the answer's right there. And every person has a responsibility to take it to heart and decide if they want to be, part of the conversation to enhance civility or not. So whenever you're feeling distraught that there's nothing you can do, there's absolutely stuff you can do. And if you want to expand that activism beyond how you speak, call it out when you see it. If you see a letter to the editor in the newspaper, a comment on social media that is less than civil, call it out. And, we all deserve better. So I think, I could go on and on. I've got a few more notes on the page, but I'll stop there. But I did want to add one thing because Tim mentioned it when he was talking about etiquette and rules in the courtroom. I was just reading a case from 1970 that the U.S. Supreme Court considered. And in that case, a man was going to be sentenced to prison for a variety of crimes he committed. And he wanted to represent himself. And during his trial, he kept insulting the judge, was being disruptive, wasn't following the rules of etiquette and the decorum that the court required. And so the judge expelled him. And the Supreme Court reviewed it because as a citizen of this country, you have a right to confront your accusers if they're trying to send you to jail. And so he made that argument that he was being denied a constitutional right. And the court said, that's true. But the only way that this works is if we have some decorum and we have some rules of etiquette. And so they held his case was valid and he was sentenced to time. But it really did have me thinking about the importance of etiquette, politeness, manners, rules. And I know that sounds a little like old-fashioned, but maybe that's what we need.
Alexander, would you maybe weigh in?
Sure. Thank you all. Thank you for those insights. I would just say in response collectively, I echo a number of those sentiments. I would add from a conversation in the classroom today that we should state I agree or I disagree. As was just mentioned, I also think we need to take it a step further because a young lady who voted for President Trump and I had a nice exchange in which she asked me, how do you recognize in conversation when you don't want to alienate someone or potentially lose a friend in the college campus environment, and answer that question. And I brought up an episode of my program I did with a scholar from the University of Wisconsin-Madison on resentment in politics and how the best way to get at it, is really to look at the causal relationship and to reach a point of comfort with your constituents or your neighbors, your peers, where an answer to a question is not, I voted for Secretary Clinton or I voted for President Trump because they care about me. And if that is your definition of politics, I think that's a sad reflection of sort of, just in kind of egomaniacal, narcissistic view of who we are as a people. And so thinking about voting through the lens of, policies that advantage or disadvantage my community, but thinking about it through the lens of those policies and not through the lens of animus towards any single group. And then I would just add with respect to anonymity in Jefferson and Adams, I think that's a point well taken, but they were actually delivering those messages through their emissaries and anonymously and not face to face in the way that Donald Trump would say crooked Hillary and then she would say delete your account. And representing those as human beings is a world of difference, I think, than what was documented as kind of the infamous scribblers of our founding. And there's sure as hell a lot of anonymous quotes, and we deserve people with the integrity who are going to stand behind real thought processes, real convictions, real assertions. And that couldn't be more important for, I think, my line of work to recognize. In the same vein, we've kind of normalized it to the point where I do think we're going to be successful with candidates who represent that restoration of civil norms and demonstrations of them, like we just heard, in decorum, in conduct, in policy. And the final thing I'd say is I kind of do connect civility to policy insofar as, there is the definition of civility that is decorum and decency, but then there's the definition of civility and what is sort of dignified and human dignity. And that's why I kind of concocted this phrase in a piece that I wrote during the New Hampshire primary cycle, trickle-down discourse, because I think it infuses in the civility crisis this reality that we don't have enough economic empowerment as citizens. And that seemed to be a consensus from the candidates who ran in 2016, and they may be betraying that promise, but I think that you'll see a revival of that message in 2020 because of that New York Times article that I referenced and the real data to back it up.
So we're going to move to Q&A. I'd invite people who are here in the A&S auditorium to come on down to the aisle over here, to pose a question. And let me remind those of you who are listening to us or watching us on public television that you can email a question to civility@wyomingpbs.org. In order to get to as many questions as possible in the next half hour, I'd ask you maybe state your name and just ask a question and let us know who you are directing the question to. So questions rather than long statements, please. Go ahead.
All right, Michael Basinger, a graduate student, and this is to the entire panel. And it follows from my new T-shirt motto, which is trickle down civility, or there's some wording of that. We have civility, as you've all pointed out, is a rhetorical art. It has to do with caring, it has to do with decorum, it has to do with the quality of what is said. And in our democracy, we have a first speaker from which decorum trickles down. And in 2 years, we have gone from someone whose, whatever you think of their politics, whose rhetoric was thoughtful, measured, and civil, and I'll just quote Hamlet's lament, see what follows. My question is this to the entire group. Should we not hold the presidency to the highest standard of all when it comes to civility?
Who would like to start?
Well, maybe I'll go back to the comment I made at the end, and I mean, it depends on who we as the voters certainly should hold the president and all their elected officials to a certain standard of civility. The question is, where are they going to draw the line? And I mean, it's easiest, I think, to point to the president, because like I said, you've had politicians, and he's a good example that just sort of blast through those conventions and those bright lines that we've thought were in place for a long, long time. But you see it across the political spectrum, and you see it, Marilyn mentioned, even down into school district races, And so, yeah, I think we as voters, we as citizens should demand from our elected officials, including the president, to be an example for us in model what discussion should be.
I'd argue that we have a system that holds our president accountable. You know, these positions of power, you know, I had the great opportunity to travel to China, and it really makes you appreciate how open and sometimes ugly our elections can be, how, you know, we really have difficult conversations, but I wouldn't have it any other way. And, you know, the question is, you know, how is that kind of enforced? And so, you know, we value freedom of speech, and I take that very seriously. So I think that a lot of the civility discussion is how we can ask people to do things but not require it of them. And so, you know, I'm certainly not in support of measures that would restrict speech or style. And, you know, our electorate has an opportunity every election cycle to hold their elected leaders accountable. And so I think that we do have that system in place, and people are free to vote how they want to vote in another 2 years when it comes to our presidential seat.
Alexander?
I think, as with a lot of moments in American political history, you kind of get the opposite of what you had, you know, strong reaction. Sometimes it's a perfect storm or tsunami that brings that about. In not expecting the outcome of electing someone, and also the expectation that the way Donald Trump behaved as a candidate is not necessarily the way he would behave as president. And that's a common sentiment among disillusioned Trump voters that I've heard on my program and from reports that are out there. I would just say, you know, we certainly need for character to count and be incentivized, not by law, but by ensuring that our media and our political process do value that, you know, dignity of speech and content of character. If you notice, the three examples that I suggested were not enforcements of policy. They were due diligence and discretion by media that have exhibited anything but due diligence and discretion.
Next question.
We have a question to civility at wyomingpbs.org. It's from Shannon, and she asks, what role does the lack of political and demographic diversity in Wyoming play in civility here? Are minority opinions more suppressed? Thank you.
Okay. Marilyn?
Well, I guess I would say that on a scale, if you look across the country, that Wyoming, I mean, I used to think we were immune to what was going on in the rest of the country, and we clearly are not. And we do have a lack of diversity in the state just demographically. But I don't think that has caused or had an impact, at least my observation would be, on our civility or our lack of civility. I think we are a small state, and it's a little harder to be uncivil to someone that you're going to see at the grocery store. So, you know, I guess in direct answer to the question, I don't see that as having had an impact in Wyoming on the lack of civility.
Tim or Rafi, you've been involved in campaigns more recently.
I'll chime in. I serve in the Wyoming Senate, and at the time that I ran, there was one woman serving, and was talking to my daughter. I had her in the Senate gallery. We were watching the debate, and she asked me, Mom, do they let girls be in the Senate? And I said, yeah, they do. There's one lady right there. And I didn't have the heart to tell her that that woman had just announced she was retiring. It was Senator Bernadine Kraft from Sweetwater County. And so again, talking about things that were playing in my mind of why I needed to step up my game and become more involved was the idea of a Wyoming Senate without a woman, and it really frightened me. But aside from, you know, being a woman, I'm also Native American. And I can tell you that as a Navajo person growing up in Wyoming, I think that there are definitely situations where people are intentionally trying to insult you. But I also think that there's a lot of people who are struggling to find the right words to ask questions that are really important to have answered. Questions about culture, how you properly ask if someone's got a tribal affiliation. Is it better to say Native American or American Indian? And I think if your reaction is to feel offended that we're talking about race issues, we're not serving anybody's interest. And so, you know, certainly for those people who have gone out of their way, I think, to intentionally insult my race or my gender, it's very easy for me to just simply walk away because it's really not worth my time to engage in that kind of discussion. But for those of my friends who maybe say stuff that's a little off color, that, you know, what a great opportunity to have those conversations. And so, my experience, I'd say, is much more on the latter half of people who really want to learn. And, what a great opportunity to have the Wyoming legislature have a tribal relations committee that I get to serve on. And I think that that's something we're very committed to doing, is really improving relationships with tribal members, and really applaud all the efforts here at your University of Wyoming for reaching out to our reservation communities, trying to increase enrollment and retain those students. So that would be my take on that.
Next question.
Christine Porter, and I had a question for Alexander.
Yes, ma'am.
So the narrow question is, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about what you see civility and civic discourse as being for and producing, and to why I'm asking that partly is I thought maybe I misunderstood you to talk about a capitalist core that unites us, whereas I have always thought about civic discourse as serving democracy. And so if you could speak to that, or other outcomes you're seeking from democracy and, from civic discourse. And since I'm talking about democracy, I have been deeply concerned, or am interested in that as our core. The surveys of millennials in particular, but across the country, of thinking about democracy as being important or as a good way for us to navigate our country politically, have been dropping dramatically. And that, to me, that I wonder if that's a little bit cause and effect with civic discourse not working, or so I'd love to hear you.
Sure.
Thoughts on that.
I was really in referencing the precondition of democratic theater, discourse, whatever you want to call it. I was identifying our economy because there are those who would say that our way of life, rugged individualism, the great expanse of humanity and individual freedom is under assault. I think that if you look at the economic trajectory of our country, the reality of our democratic norms is that capitalism is the way we operate. I mean, there are parameters through which we may want to acknowledge American citizens and their rights. And there's a question for this generation about the right to health care, and whether or not that ought to be a question of decency and dignity, and delivering that as the promise if you contribute to this country and improve this country. And so you mentioned some public surveys that have indicated young people disenchanted with democracy or not identifying speech or other elements of free society as requisite or important. I think it's a little overblown based on the data that I've looked at, and certainly overblown based on the anecdotal evidence traveling from campus to campus in a pretty diverse constituency of young people with whom I'm interacting. And so I would say that I'm not personally, or from the journalistic work that I do, afraid of that kind of anti-democratic conflagration. But I would say civility is also interconnected with the law. These experts know that. And we've reached a point in our politics where, whenever so often this happens, we think of the inseparability now of law and politics, and you are, sort of legal or lawful, or in the context of what is correct, if you politically skew one way or another. And that is a frightening prospect of civil society, laws, natural, state, federal, that we've come to acknowledge as important to preserving our way of life, not being rigged or judged by whether you favor progressive taxation or flat tax, or whether you believe in any number of issues that we assess. So I'm more concerned with a politics that takes over legal norms that we all agree with, especially with the way the Free Press and FBI have come under scrutiny. And let me just point out that there's no precedent in recent memory I have where a United States president condemns, chastises the free press in the way that the current president does, or condemns or critiques the FBI, which is law enforcement community. And that's a major aberration. So I'm more concerned about the effect that has on the discourse and folks coming of age, because I think young people themselves view there to be great opportunity in the realization of that perfect union. And healthcare is one example where I think, more and more you're seeing conservative communities rally around care, affordable care. We said earlier, patient protection, and I don't think that's going to be a partisan issue in the relatively near future, because I think young people are waking up to the fact that if you contribute to our economy, if you're a diligent, working, caring United States citizen, in the present inequity, healthcare ought to be a right, because of just how much the economy is stacked against everybody who's not in the boardroom. And I think that's going to become more realized over the next years.
Next question.
Hello, my name is Kate Miller. I serve as Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs here at the university. And my question is, for the whole panel, is around an assertion I have read repeatedly in the media that a reason for all this incivility is that since the Berlin Wall fell in the early 90s, that we don't have a joint external enemy, and so being humans, we need an enemy somehow, and so now we're looking across at each other across the aisle in negative ways. And so I guess my question is two-part. If you accept that hypothesis, how do you overcome it? And if you don't accept that hypothesis, how do you look at it?
Okay, Tim.
Well, I guess I would be one that would not accept that hypothesis. I mean, you can look at especially as we sit here on September 11th, you can look at the last 17 years and especially nationally have been focused on Islamic extremism as the external enemy. So I don't think that we have lacked for external enemies to focus on. And I think also as Alexander was talking historically, and as you go back through our history, there's been plenty of discourse and incivility in our society when the enemies have been at our gates. And so I just think, frankly, it's an ebb and flow that happens in our society that's based upon the fact that we are a free people and we get to say what we want to say. And we are continuously, as a society, trying to figure out where those limits need to be. And it's an uncomfortable thing, but I think it's okay to live in that discomfort. I think it's okay to live through that process. And I think, maybe I'm Pollyanna, but I think eventually we're gonna figure it out again.
Maybe Marilyn and then Nafi.
Well, I guess my reaction is similar to Tim's. I think that there's so many other things going on in society that have encouraged this lack of civility, whether it be media or the internet or whatever. I think it might have something more to do with just the economic inequality, if you will, that people are angry because of the fact that they feel like they aren't being heard or taken care of, or solutions aren't being developed for them, and that they are angry. And if you're angry, you kind of get uncivil. So I think it's too simplistic to say it's a result of the Berlin Wall or some major change in international relations. And you make a good point, Tim, that we are all feeling threatened in one way or the other by terrorism and the problems that has created across the world. So in direct answer to your question, it just seems to me like that's not the problem. The problem's real, but it's got a multiple causes.
Effie, and then Alexander.
Yeah, I would agree with Marilyn and Tim on this. You know, I remember 9/11 and how awful that day was, and you know, today's the day that we remember. But you know, thinking back, you know, if you read some of your history books, and I think of my ancestors and Native people that, you know, their daily life consisted of trying to find food and religious sustenance, or filled with other religious activities. But just thinking about being in Wyoming and what pioneers used to do to get through their days, and you know, the wonderful thing that we've seen in America is this industrial revolution, and the promise of that was that we'd have more time for leisure, that we would actually start enjoying the fruits of our labor and have more time to enjoy the good life. And it seems like we've filled that with a lot of time that we spend arguing about things that at the end of the day, not a lot of us have any control over. You know, and I'll talk about Nike and kneeling for the flag. I mean, we're all engulfed in this conversation, but at the end of the day, I'm a state senator, and this really has nothing to do with anything I can control. So, you know, I think that it's, we do have, fortunately, time that we can spend on leisure, but we do have time to talk about politics, and that's important. But I just kind of want to emphasize, you know, there are still really great bright spots, and I think some of this is because the world has gotten a little bit smaller and bigger in some ways. You know, with social media, we're so interconnected, but, you know, the con of that, I think, that Marilyn pointed out was you don't see, you know, your critics necessarily at the grocery store when they live in another state, and I've had people reach out to me from other states caring about things happening in Wyoming. So kind of losing those one-on-one connections or those opportunities, and I think in Wyoming, and we all know this, we have such accessibility to our elected officials. In other larger states where, you know, there are millions of people, they just don't have the accessibility that we do. So in Wyoming, I think that's a really wonderful thing. And a reason why I think being involved in politics in Wyoming is still a really worthwhile endeavor. And along those lines, I was recently going door to door in my neighborhood. My daughter was selling chocolate bars, and I knocked on a gal's door, and she said, "I know who you are, and I remember I contacted you, and I was really mad about something, and you took the time to write me a letter, and I didn't agree with what you had to say, but I remember how kind you were in your letter, that you responded to me, and it seems that you listened." And she said, "I can't even remember why I was so mad. I can't even remember it. But I remember you being civil." And so, you know, I don't think all hope is lost. I just think it's a call to arms to do what we know that we should be doing, to treat people with dignity, to treat people with respect, to listen, to understand, to learn. Again, these are all things that all of us in this room can be doing, and if we all just make a commitment to really beat that drum, I think we'll have a really widespread impact.
Alexander?
I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think that 9/11 was the event sort of that you attribute to the wall falling. For me personally, as a young person growing up and having roots in New York. And so I do relate to your comment because that was really the beginning of a consciousness and a cognizance of community and my place in the world as being informed about, you know, this horrid devastation and how we can overcome. So I agree with the premise insofar as, you know, we ought to be inspired, and it can't just be in response to, you know, an act of war or genocide or something that is actually tearing at the seams more explicitly. And yet we do preserve the free expression and don't have the control over, you know, single acts of federal elected officials. Have more control over, you know, writing a letter to your local representative and having that dialogue and that learning experience. I just say to close, you know, we hope that in these next months, a president who's spoken quite erratically is not going to go on a binge of pardons, for instance, and kind of betray the fundamental fabric that we do have as Americans. But those kinds of events, which are speculative at the moment, but they certainly, you know, I don't recall a president in recent history who went on a binge of pardons of his political allies in the first months or 2 years of his presidency. I mean, so there are aspects of this presidency that could actually provide that wake-up call, and they've already provided a wake-up call to engaging new constituencies of voters with whom I've interacted on my program. And so I think the election of Donald Trump is going to motivate people, both who like him and don't like him, or the policies that he and his administration are enacting. But I'd just say that we have to be alert no matter which party is in office, because we find ourselves, especially speaking someone from media, educational television, but still part of the wider press, a victim. And don't think for a second, I think in the recent instances of terrorism threats that have been made against journalists, that this can't be attributed to comments coming from the highest level of our government. I think you have to make a logical correlation, and that's something that speaks to me viscerally, just like 9/11 as a native New Yorker.
Okay, I think we have we'll take this question here.
My question is for the entire panel. As a means for promoting civil discourse, do you think that certain people, like extremists, either on the left or right, should be excluded from the conversation? And if so, how would you go about identifying them?
No. Tim?
Yeah, and just to expand it a little bit more, I think what we could do, though, and what we should do better, and it sort of ties in with what Alexander was talking about on the social media aspect, is in order to have effective voters and effective consumers of information, you got to know where the information is coming from. And so I agree, you shouldn't be barred for whatever you say by whoever you are, but you should at least, those who are in the business of sharing that have to be better at allowing us as those consumers of information to know where it's actually coming from.
Affy or Alexander?
I would agree with Justice Kite. No, I think they should not be excluded at all. But to Tim's point, that's one of George Washington's rules of civility. Be not apt to relate news if you know not the truth thereof. What a powerful lesson.
Twitter
this still
profile
applies, right? Along those lines, George Washington, I was reading all of these rules of civility, and some of them are very applicable today, and they're things we know. Don't laugh at your own jokes. That's one of them. It says don't drink or talk with your mouth full. These are things we still adhere to as etiquette in our country. So take some time to read his rules, because there are other things that I think are really important for us to consider. And, as far as these extremism or extreme factions of both parties, absolutely they have their place. But I guess as an elected official, my question is always, what's your end game? Are you coming to yell at me because you want to effectuate change? Because I can tell you the more personal the attack, the louder, the screaming, the anger. I'm a human being. I don't respond well to that. If your objective is to provide some meaningful change for a care or cause that you really are passionate about, what's your end game? If it's to make a difference, then maybe rethink your strategy.
Okay, we've got two more questions.
Well said.
Yeah, to the whole panel. Mr. Heffner, you ended your discourse on noting on an idea about trickle-down discourse, that the expression of 2016 was an idea, could be attributed to low economic empowerment. A, doesn't that kind of clash to the low turnout numbers that were actually seen in that election? And B, what does the panel overall, each of the panel members, think of the ideas that big formal institutions like elections, legislatures, perhaps even judiciary are somewhat outdated, that maybe even big ideas like the National Football League and national consciousness have kind of run their course and might just be relegated to what we think of as 20th century thinking? Thank you.
Okay. Alexander, you want to
Sure,
go
I'll
first?
just take quickly, I think the majority of this country didn't vote in 16, so I think that it substantiates the point about the dumbing down associated with dumber discourse. You're much more likely to vote the more income you make, So I think, the idea of trickle-down economics combined with sort of the amusement of our politics to death is a real thing. That's how I came up with that term. I just say amen to what you just said about endgame. I mean, I said that almost similarly, identically similarly to students the other day. What is the motivation of the person? Are they sincere? What values they represent, and so I just was really moved by what you said.
Marilyn?
If I understand the question right, I mean, of course we should be open to bigger ideas and solutions that maybe we haven't thought of. But in terms of the structure of our government, we've got a lot of problems, but I don't think anybody that I know of can point to a system, a structure that could function better to try to govern a country of this size with this disparate interests than what we have. It's not perfect, but the concept of people voting and creating both the legislative branch and the executive branch, but the executive branch being restrained by the laws created by the legislative branch, and an independent judiciary, as independent as we can humanly make it, interpreting the law and applying the law and requiring that it be followed. And we have seen that even in these crazy times we live in, that the courts have such an impact. I certainly don't know of any other structure and governmental system that could had the potential of working better than ours has. Doesn't mean ours is working as it maybe even in some cases was intended by our founders, but I certainly don't think it's a outdated concept.
Tim or Rafi, do you want to add a thought? And then we'll go to the last question.
I would almost double down on what Justice Kite said, which is I think the problems aren't because our institutions have outlived their usefulness. I think it's because we now ignore fundamentals of those institutions. And you see this in Congress, I think, just articulated or illustrated really powerfully, that instead of working bills through the process, instead of arguing, instead of amending, you have this approach that, well, if it's bad for Democrats, I'm for it. If it's good for Republicans, I'm for it. That's all I need to know. Throw down your 1,400-page bill, and we don't need to work it. We don't need to amend it. We don't need to see how we could make it better for the American people. That's ignoring the fundamentals and the structure of the processes that were set up to govern us in the first place. And I think that's the core of our problem, not the institutions themselves.
Rafi, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I think we just, as the United States of America, we were founded on some very fierce principles that protect individualism. And I fear that, we forget that sometimes. In politics, we've got the two-party system, and I think it's a race of, this political purity test, who can prove their credentials, who's more conservative, who's more progressive, who's more liberal. And, going back to, again, my little kid philosophies, you talk about snowflakes being unique and fingerprints being unique. And, having served in the legislature, we literally take thousands of votes, and Tim knows this. I'm guessing Tim and I are probably similarly like-minded, but our voting records could be wildly different. And how we've gotten away from that notion and that value that every single person in that audience, and I'm looking at you, that we all have our own little, political fingerprints that are yours alone. And you'd be hard-pressed, I think, to find someone else in the world who thinks exactly like you do on every single issue. And so why we don't recognize that and respect that it doesn't make sense to me. But we have this system that allows for all those individuals to participate and to have a voice. And so I think it's really respecting that individuality which makes America so great.
Okay, last question.
Hi, I'm Xavier Peterson. I'm a senior here at Laramie High School. My question is also for the entire panel. As has been said, people will throw out all kinds of insults and things online, email, whatever, and come time to talk in person, they can't even look you in the eye. They'll stumble over their words. They don't want to say it. And from what I've seen, that largely comes from a sense of invulnerability and anonymity online. People hide behind their username, or they hide behind a fake email address, something like that, so you can't contact them again. And I was just wondering what you all think is the best way to hold those people accountable to what they say online. Thank you.
Go ahead, Marilyn.
I probably shouldn't even answer this question because I'm incompetent because I'm not online on most of these questions. But I guess my thought would be to ignore them. You can't hold them accountable. There's no way to know who they are. And if we let them have an impact on policy or on our own happiness or lives, we're giving them power. So that would be my comment. Ignore them.
I'm just going to run the panel. Tim?
Okay. Yeah, Affy and I were talking about that same issue before we started. A former Wyoming House Speaker used to describe those folks as men in their underwear sitting in the middle of the night furiously typing away on Facebook and sending, invective to you. And I do think, I mean, if these are people that don't really want to engage, to some extent, you just have to sort of gird up and take it. But the tough thing, I think, as a policymaker, and I think Affy would probably has seen this as well, is that it gets really hard to decipher that noise from the true impact and the true input that your constituents have. So that's the real challenge. If you can figure out what is noise and what is not, then I do think you just need to set it to the side.
Affy?
I've given this issue a lot of thought, and I scroll to Facebook, and you see what always makes me laugh is when you see maybe a politician put up a really benign post, attending an event or talking to a constituent, and then I'll see the angry face. Somewhere out there, your elected politician doing their job, meeting with a constituent, warrants an angry face, and I always have to look. I'm like, who's the angry face? I'm curious to know who this person is. And, as someone that's been on the receiving end of some angry faces, I'm just got impressed on this enough. Like, these are people, did not sign up for that. So I'm trying to really grow through this process as a person of how do I deal with that on a very personal level, because I have feelings. And it really, for me, comes down to a very spiritual one. Those people that are so angry probably need my prayers the most, so I pray for them.
Okay, Alexander, we're giving you the last thought.
Sure. I take a slightly different approach, and I agree with what's been said, but I also agree with your premise that there has to be more accountability, because I don't think you can ignore an onslaught of bigotry. Sunlight is a great disinfectant, but not if you're overrun with the magnification of hate. And what these social media platforms failed to do was to import a sense of conviction to sort of responsible discourse. And to that gentleman's question about sort of norms in public speaking, I think it's not just, the answer is no, you're not going to bar someone who has a strong conviction, but if they're engaging in violence, if they're inciting political violence, criminal activity, or if they're just proven bigots who don't have any intent other than to spew their bigotry, then we have to think about if our value system is compatible with that, and each and every institution or club or environment in which there might be speakers has to consider those consequences as a function of such invitations. But so your question about accountability is important, and it should be us, the users of these platforms, the shareholders of these platforms, and the platforms themselves ultimately, that recognize that if they are ignoring the mainstreaming of bigotry, whether that's against people based on their zip code, based on their race, based on their religion, based on their party affiliation, then that's wrong. And the appearance has been that they're not being ignored, they're being magnified. So I think it's a really important question.
Can I add one thing?
Sure.
And I don't think it's settled by any stretch, because I was just reading an article about a Maryland governor, I think it was from Maryland, maybe I'm wrong, but a governor whose Facebook page was deleting comments and blocking users, and I've done that both. I won't have vulgar comments on my Facebook page or my social media platforms, but there was a discussion about whether or not that's infringement of your First Amendment rights. And so I think the courts will be asked to look at these issues and how much you can hold a person accountable for the speech that they have. But it gets into that interesting question of whether or not you've actually got an official government action taking your right away to participate in social media, versus, what's the level of a platform that you need to provide to anyone to voice whatever opinion they have. So I think we're in a really interesting time to apply our First Amendment rights and think of it through a completely different lens. So I think that's an ongoing thing for us to all consider.
Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to bring this conversation to a close. I have a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, I want to thank all of you for participating and all of you for coming. Second, those of us here at UW who have been able to put on this event, we do value your feedback. You have a feedback form close to you probably. We ask you to fill it out and to give it to one of the students in the back or to put it on the table out front. And then I have one final thing, and that is, so we have 4 cowboys and cowgirls, I'm just going to say it that way, up here on stage, but we wanted to make sure that we had a 5th. So in order to have a 5th cowboy, because the world needs one more. Alexander, thank you for coming to UW.
Go Pokes.
Thank you for coming.